Shana Tova. We are now entering the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days of repentance. And that means it's time for some confessions. Now, this is an old one, because I didn't realize that I had done something wrong until just recently. My daughter Hannah is now at university, and that meant that I got to have the joy of looking over the classes that she was considering taking, and I also got the shock of the way they handle textbooks now. Anybody who's been to university recently will know that they're still continuing the same old scam of a new edition every year so that you have to buy a new book and you can't just get a used one. But you can rent your textbooks now. Literally, rent them through Amazon or some even just purely online. You rent the book and eventually, bing, it'll expire and you no longer have access to it. This was a knife in my heart, because when I was at university, I used to love the couple days right before the semester would begin. I'd go to the bookstore. It was a physical store. And I'd walk and find all the books I needed for my classes. And I'd also browse. And I'd look and see what were the other classes taking. What books were they having? It wasn't anything that I was in, but some of them looked really good. And so I'd pick up a copy from this class, a copy from that class, and put it in my basket and get to the till. And, it was all going on student loans anyway, so, yeah, that's another discussion. And it wasn't until I was having a conversation about Hannah's books and buying them and all of that, that I was saying, very matter-of-factly, 20, almost 30 years later, well, of course they need to know how many people are in the class so they know how many books to order. And it hit me. I had been taking books from classes I wasn't enrolled in, which meant they were probably short a couple of copies when it came time for other students who maybe didn't go days early to browse through the bookstore. And those kids may have had trouble finding the books they needed at our little bookstore because I had been buying things that I was merely interested in, but didn't actually need for my degree. Al chet shechatanu. I confess before you, God, I made it harder for someone else to learn. But there's a follow-up to that confession. I confess before you, God, this last summer, I got rid of some of those books finally. Yes, from my university in Stockton to San Diego, from San Diego to Baltimore, from Baltimore to Florida, for 30 years, those books have been with me. I don't give up books easily. But this last summer, Penelope and I decided, you know what, really, if there are books that we haven't looked in for 10, 15, 20 years, if there are books about politics in India from 1992, maybe it's time to give those books a new home. Maybe it's time, and it was one of the more painful things I've ever done, trying to sort through who would live and who would die. Who would stay on the bookshelves and who would go to the used bookstore. And we ended up with quite a load. The bookstore was a little surprised when we kept hauling in bag after bag. And we said, so this is about 1/10 of what's left at our house, but the rest in our house we're not getting rid of. So it scratched the surface, but it also hurt inside. And so now I'm doubly confessing that not only did I take those books that made life harder for those other students years ago, I didn't even hold on to them forever. But maybe that's not such a confession anymore, because apparently now you just rent your books and nobody expects to own anything and it'll vanish in a few months. So maybe no one cares about that sin of mine except me. But I will tell you that our love of books as a people, as a nation, is something that I have found to be an indelible part of all of our children's psyche. Child after child after child that comes and sits down before me for the beginning of their bar mitzvah tutoring are shocked. They are aghast that their rabbi sins. Because I show them, I make notes in my books. I make notes in my books. I write, not just on the cover, inside. I'll put things on pages. And when I tell them So you may want to circle this and put maybe times 2, because this part, when we sing it, we do it twice. They look at me like I said that I like to kick puppies. It's like, what are you talking about, Rabbi? I can't write in my Siddur. I mean, our kids decorate the outside. That we make sure that they do. Technically, we get their parents to do it, so they have a little more authority. But the idea of writing on the pristine pages of the Siddur, to dare to circle a line or put an arrow of where they need to be focused before the next section they shudder to a student. I have never yet had a student, when I told them, make a note in your Siddur, said sure, and just began to, never. All of them are aghast at the idea that I could suggest they would desecrate the Holy Siddur. And that's actually a little bit of a problem. I get them all to break the ice eventually. But the fact that they are so reticent is actually a little bit of a problem. So where did the Siddur come from? We know the Torah, Mount Sinai, our history, wonderful, right? Where did the Siddur come from? And the Machzor, by the way, which used to be the same book. It wasn't until fairly, late, meaning 1,500 years ago, that we began to get so much material for the Machzor, for the High Holiday liturgy, that they ended up becoming 2 books. Prior to that, they were 1 book, and you would just pick the parts you needed for Rosh HaShanah and leave them out for the rest of the year. Where did this Siddur come from? What's that? The sages and the rabbis, the Tanaim, the Amoraim, the people who gave us the Mishnah, the Midrash, the Talmud. No, not them. Because they gave us the outline of our prayers. They gave us all of those Baruch Atah Adonai lines that begin or end different paragraphs. They gave us those. And they said, this is a prayer that you should say about creation, and you should finish it with Yotzer Or. But what do you actually pray? That's up to you. You pray. You find the words. And when you find the words and you have said the prayer, finish it with this line. Seal it with this so that you follow the pattern. And then when you turn to the concept of Ahavah, of love and God's Torah, finish it with this line. And so on and so forth. And through all the Amidah, they gave us the taglines. But we were meant to fill in the rest. And not fill in the rest the same way every day. Fill in the rest with spontaneity, with improvisation, with inspiration, day after day, service after service, blessing after blessing, still following the pattern that they laid out for us, because that pattern avoids both nihilism and solipsism and egoism and all of the problems that can come when we are left entirely to our own devices to think of what to say before God. But the meat on the bones, that was for us to chew, to understand, to feel, and to know what we personally needed to say within that structure each time. And let me tell you, it's exhausting, as our ancestors found out. It's hard to come up with what to say. Anybody here who's ever bought a pre-made gift, birthday card or anniversary card from Hallmark knows that you probably could have come up with something very nice to say, but honestly, do you really want to have to come up with something novel and new every time it's a new birthday, anniversary, or holiday? Isn't it just easier to buy one off the shelf where someone else has already taken the time to review, to edit, to proofread, and to decide what would be the really best phrases? And they come up with such good insights that I wouldn't have thought of. And indeed, this is how the first Siddur was born. Someone wrote a letter to one of the Gaonim, one of the great rabbis of the Babylonian community. This is long after Babylonian the empire, but as Jews, we don't change names quickly. And they said, Rabbi, we're having trouble filling in the blanks. We've got the skeleton, of course, from the Mishnah and the Talmud. We know what our prayer service should look like, but we're not sure how to fill it in. And so the Gaon wrote back a letter and filled in. He said, well, this would be a normal way to fill it in. These words would work. And they said, great, thank you. Those are what we'll use. It was the other side of the world, so he couldn't correct them. It's the problem with writing things down, and it's the reason why they had not been written down prior to that. because our tradition was very reluctant to write these things down, for fear that they would become codified and ossified, turned into a fossil. And at first, that's not exactly what happened. At first, what happened was, of course, that people began to circulate copies of the letter, and people said, wow, that's really nice, that's brilliant, I never would have thought to say it that way, or it's more succinct than my own, or the poetry is more beautiful than my own. But I've also heard such and such when he leaves, and he says it this way. And someone would say, oh, I like that. And they'd write it in the margins. And then that would get copied to the next person. And someone else would say, well, in my community, we also include this psalm. Someone says, that psalm is great. We never say it enough. Let's put it in. And little by little, people would add to the Siddhur. And then, lo and behold, a miracle happened. Gutenberg, the printing press. And at the printing press, the Siddhur died. Because now the Siddhur became the printed text. Now it became official. And now the difference between your writing and the printer's writing was much clearer. Because when I write in my Siddhur now, it's very obvious, anybody who's ever seen my handwriting will know this, that it is mostly illegible to everyone, including me sometimes. Whereas the typesetting, that is beautiful and clear. You can immediately tell what I wrote, you can immediately tell what the Siddhur wrote. But you can still see that someone else wrote in my Siddhur before I got a hold of it. They're called the editor. They got to write in the page numbers, the instructions, the notes, the comments, all of the other little tidbits, and they got to decide how to arrange it. And once that goes to press, it becomes sacred. And anything that I add to it becomes the kind of things that make our children uncomfortable. And this is a problem. We feel that there is no more room in the Siddhur for us. We feel there is no more room, perhaps in Judaism, for us, for me, for the individual expression. I am here to fulfill the letter on the page, and when I have done so, I am done. And I'm done. And once I have done that, if I find it to be lacking in personal meaning or significance, well, I did it. Maybe I won't do it again if it wasn't that great when I did it like it's on the page. When I read those words, they didn't speak to me. So I guess those words are not for me. And I guess, therefore, the Siddhur and the Masur and the Torah and everything else is not for me. Because I don't have the courage to see that these have been phrases in the Siddhur and Masur that have changed over time to speak constantly to the hearts of those who utter them. But we seem to be running short on courage to recognize where there is room for change, adaptation, and personal expression. But we have not always been like that. And I don't only mean with the Siddhur. Think back to the 1800s. One of the times of the greatest courage of our people, when everything was changing. Think of the courage of being a young Zionist living somewhere in Europe. And some guy comes to your town and says, much to the rabbi's annoyance, that they want to establish a settlement in the land of Israel. Oh, sure, it's controlled by the Ottoman Empire right now, but they want to start a farm, a town, a village, and they are looking for volunteers. All you have to do is leave the Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, wherever you might be. That's all. Just leave everything behind. And you will go off to this place, this land flowing with milk and honey, which isn't really flowing so well right now, where everybody speaks a different language, and it will be a paradise. Yeah, right. And we got a Brooklyn Bridge to sell you, right? Or maybe some nice land in Florida. And most people did not listen to this idea. They said, no, we're happy here. And if not happy, we are at least safe. And if not safe, at least content. And if not content, well, at least it's what we know. And so we'll stay right where we are. But a small group of Jews said, you know what? Let's write another chapter. Let's write in the margins and say, yes, we believe and love our communities and families, but we also believe that there is a call to us to go back to the land of Israel, and we are going to answer that call. Had they not had that courage to write their own sentences, to write that own new chapter, 1 million more Jews would have been trapped in Europe by the time of the 20th century. And 1 million more Jews would have been living throughout the 20th century, or many more as they continued to have children, under Arab despotism because there was no land of Israel for them to go to. Rather than it being the last Jew leaving Afghanistan this week, there would still be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands perhaps, if the population curve had continued, of Jews trapped under the Taliban. If there had not been a Medinat Israel, a place, a state of Israel for them to go. But there was such a place because a few had the courage to write those sentences, to change those notes, and to say, we are going to stay within what Judaism teaches, but we're going to do it this way. And how many of you come from families that had a similar reflection, and maybe didn't point themselves towards the land of Israel, but pointed themselves towards Artsot Habrit, to the United States? They looked at what was going on in Europe or other parts of the Near East and said, you know what? We think we should take a gamble on this thing called North America, and South America, and South Africa, and eventually Australia, and New Zealand. That maybe living in the same places where we've been living for 500, 1,000, 2,000 years is not going to cut it anymore, because these places have problems that are not going away soon. But maybe we can go to some of these other places and take a chance. And it won't be perfect, but we can write some new sentences. We can make a new paragraph, maybe even a chapter, and change. How many more millions would have been left in Europe if your ancestors had not made that choice, had not had the courage to get on those boats and sail away from what was rapidly becoming untenable? And recognizing that when they did so, they were castigated by the traditionalists of their community. How dare they think they know better? How dare they think they get the right to make these decisions? How dare they think that Judaism was somehow bound up in them and their choices? Judaism was only for the choices of those at the top of the community, and everyone else should simply listen. We all come from people who disagreed with that idea. It's one of the reasons why, especially in America, American Jews are so much fun to try and wrangle together into harmony, because we are descended from a long line of iconoclasts and rebels. But where has our rebelliousness gone? How set in our ways have we become? Even as you sit here and reflect on this last year, are you thinking of what you can change? Or are you thinking of how late is lunch going to be? Are you thinking of what new sentence can I write for myself this coming year? What new paragraph, what new chapter can I write? What word can I edit into my life? A letter, anything. Or do you believe, like our ancestors did in Europe, that you are at the pinnacle of life and everything is perfect and hunky-dory, and you might as well just stay exactly where and how you are? Because who are you to change? Maybe you don't think you need it. Maybe you don't think you're allowed to. Maybe you think you don't deserve to. Maybe you don't think you're able to. That is not the courage of our people. That is not the courage of our people that followed Moses out of Egypt and complained. It's not the courage of our people who settled in the land under Joshua and complained. It's not the courage of our people who went from country to country to country throughout our centuries and complained, but who built and wrote and created a culture, a wisdom, unlike any other, They had the courage to say, you know what, tomorrow should be a little different than today. It doesn't have to be big different. I'm saying everybody here should go out and become rabbis. Maybe a few, it's okay, I can tell you. We'll talk. But is there nothing that you want to change? You look at the crises of the world, the crises of our nation, the crises of your own life, or maybe even the desires of your heart, and none of you think, you know what? 5782, I'm doing that. Or 5782, I'm not doing that anymore. Just a little change. And you think, oh, the climate, it's terrible. Oh, what are we going to do? I don't know. Wash your clothes on cold. Makes a huge difference. 70% of the energy that goes into keeping clothes clean comes from washing them in hot water. Wash them on cold. All of the mainstream brands are designed to work in cold now, for precisely this reason, but we still wash them hot. Why? Because it's the way we've always done it. It says it on the tag. Actually, if you check your tags, a lot of them don't say that anymore. Wash it on cold. You save the energy, and not only that, your clothes last longer, and now you're not burning through them as quickly. It's a little thing, not so hard. Possible to do, of course. Do we have the courage to change how we've done laundry? I don't know. Dare we? Maybe there's something that you've always wanted to do as a hobby, of an interest. You've always wanted to learn how to water ski. You've always wanted to learn how to paint. You've always wondered whether you could develop poetry. Okay, try it. Do you think there are no online classes for poetry and painting? Trust me, after a year and a half of COVID, there's an online class for everything. And the entry level is not that high. They expect you to be a beginner. So why not? Because you haven't? Because you're afraid you might not like it if you actually try it? So? What catastrophe will this bring to your life? Is really making these kinds of decisions so much harder than deciding to get on a boat and travel the Atlantic or travel the Mediterranean, to hike across Europe to the land of Israel, to end up in lands where you don't speak a language and maybe don't even know anyone else? But we're afraid to change our laundry detergent? We're afraid to change our pastimes? We're afraid of a new melody in our service. We're afraid of a new insight from our tradition. We want things to only be the same because we're already comfortable. You're not comfortable. I know that because I'm one of you. And we should never be comfortable. Content, yes, that's gratitude and something that Judaism teaches. But if we ever get to the point where we really think there's nothing left to add, nothing left to write, nothing left to change, then we're actually just afraid. Or arrogant. But I don't think people here are arrogant. I think more we're just nervous. Now is the time, especially now, as we stand on Rosh HaShanah and as we stand with the world in turmoil, to recognize it's time for you to write something new. There is so much to say left in the Jewish story. But it will only be said if people like us have the courage to say it. Pick something, a small thing, a big thing, something dear to your heart, something that seems trivial, and write it for yourself with your own words, your own heart, your own passion. We'll talk about how it goes next year. Shana Tova.